Back in 1899, a bunch of remote prison colonies got together and decided it was time to forge a new national identity for the inhabitants of Terra Australis. Of course, we weren't quite apt to forge it in blood like our American cousins in their Revolutionary War, but nonetheless, Victoria led the charge in bringing this continent together as one, with New South Wales reluctant to share its spoils and Western Australia only coming on board when it was clear the SS Australis would leave without them. Now, of course, a list of eligible voters from the 19th century would look very different from that same voting list today, because voting wasn't compulsory, and with women, Aboriginals and anyone who didn't own real estate only just discovering suffrage, popular support for the new nation and its fledgling constitution among the states topped out at 24%, but was as low as 8%. Of the 3.77 million people that lived on the continent at the time of Federation, only 422,000 of them voted to come together, which is a smidge over 11%. You fast forward 120 years to the present, and these same colonial attitudes are making a comeback on the national political stage. Queensland hospitals are now just for Queenslanders, leaving expectant mothers in border towns to watch their kids die as they're rerouted away from the closest facilities. Western Australia will keep their door shut well into next year, even to COVID-free residents of South Australia and the top end. Tasmania too was happy to lock the rest of the country out right up until they needed personnel support from the mainland. Victorians, of course, remain unwelcome anywhere because 20,000 Victorians have contracted a virus that isn't going away anytime soon. But the most depressing aspect of the COVID-19 border wars is the strident public support for the harshest measures, whose constitutionality hasn't even been tested, let alone reaffirmed by a court. The attitudes are disturbingly similar to those of 120 years ago, with WA preferring to go it alone and the smaller economies suspicious of the motives of Victoria and New South Wales. They're cottoning on to the electoral advantage of protectionism too, with Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk proactive in tapping into that Trump-like mentality of Queenslanders. You know, the same mentality behind those "f*** off, we're full" bumper stickers. Now, Premier Mark McGowan in the West has even told the AFL to take a hike. They'd been shopping around for a stadium willing to host 30-odd thousand people for the grand final, but even the sports quarantine bubble wasn't secure enough for the mining state. They haven't even set up a system for the fly-in, fly-out workers from the east who keep that sector afloat either, so they're just going to have to sit on their hoards of treasure like a dragon until they're willing to venture back out into the world again, presumably sometime in 2022. And while ScoMo dutifully supported the premiers by backing their decisions from National Cabinet, I think even the dorky dad is starting to see he's being taken for a ride. Now, unfortunately for Scotty, the only way the legality of border closures can be tested constitutionally is through a challenge in the High Court. Clive Palmer, the mining sector's favourite moral bankrupt, launched just such a challenge based on Section 92, but the PM flip-flopped and then withdrew his federal support when his political unpopularity on the ground in WA became apparent. Now, for our constitution to have any real meaning, as the law upon which all other laws are built, every part of it must be utterly inviolable. Remember, Australia has no Bill of Rights protecting us from government overreach like the US, and the Constitution's job is essentially to protect us from politicians who would take us down the wrong path. So when Section 92 states that intercourse among the states, whether by means of internal carriage or ocean navigation, shall be absolutely free, that means free from government interference, regulatory burden and costs. The test case for this Section 92, Cole v Whitfield, originally involved a shipment of crayfish from Tasmania being quote-unquote imported from the mainland. The High Court eventually found that states could indeed keep intercourse less than absolutely free for the purposes of biosecurity, conservation, blah, 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 and suddenly those 5 judges have rendered the entire clause utterly meaningless. Basing any constitutional requirement on the government of the day's stated objectives isn't objective, permanent, or transparent. Apparently the court had never heard of a little something called spin. Only in Australia could the highest court in the land decide that the phrase absolutely free does not mean absolutely free. And right now our politicians are more interested in securing compliance with existing measures than finding out whether or not there are actually better ways to get through this pandemic. And if all they have to do is declare their protectionist laws to be for the sake of health, then what do you know, our High Court basically works for the government. In fact, policy analysis of any kind has been conspicuously absent from our national political discussion since this pandemic began. In its place, we have fear and terror. Terror that an airborne, deadly virus will strike us down unless the government of the day does everything in its power to suppress human nature. Fear of our neighbours, of our fellow Australians interstate, even of people from different parts of the same city. The government's fear campaign has been enabled by a media that's spoon-fed every day and backed up by enforcement brutality that is way over the top of the crime being alleged. In this environment, Roy Morgan's claims that 89% of Victorians from all over the state support compulsory masks at all times outside the home, and 72% support a curfew whose only real bearing on COVID-19 is that it makes life a little easier for the police, is actually understandable. Because with the whole country running scared, demanding we close the gates on each other, ScoMo's asked the premiers to get on board with a nationally consistent definition of the coronavirus hotspot, so we can all make Australia whole again by Christmas. But it took less than 24 hours for the premiers to publicly refute that idea with claims that locking down hotspots just won't work, and with no desire whatsoever to look for alternatives when the status quo is like political red meat. The whole idea looks to be dead on arrival. Just another parade of federal weakness and ineptitude for Scotty and the team, tightening the purse strings, yelling at the premiers with popular support, and preventing Australian citizens from entering or leaving, all the while appearing to make political hay by demanding states open up and get back to work. So if the people don't want it, the premiers won't countenance it, and the Prime Minister isn't willing to put anything real on the line to fight for it, what exactly is the point of Australia?